One of the fantastic opportunities for coastal communities where fishing is in decline are marine ecotourism. So you have fishermen who have the skills, the knowledge, the boats to take people out, and it's great to see that now. We're seeing that in Clare and in Cork and Kerry. But one of the problems I've seen is people now becoming aware of these animals and interacting with them. And of course, we've got a whole social media generation now going around. And I see a lot of stuff on Instagram, people getting hundreds and thousands of views, which is great, promoting basking sharks. But I would question a couple of things. What sense are you giving people of the animals? If you're making comments like, oh, this was the most special moment in my life, or this was my biggest bucket list, you're kind of talking about yourself and not the animals. Sadly, we've witnessed things when we're filming at sea, drones arriving from nowhere and suddenly, even coming over our boat like 20 feet above us. And I see some of these social media posts, people saying, oh, I flew my drone 4 kilometres out to sea. So, you're sitting on a headland looking at a screen. What sense are you getting of the animal? And how do you know if you're going too close? Because we've seen drones going too close. There's a balance to be struck.
Yeah, because you want people to be aware of them and to be aware of their beauty and their value. But at the same time, you want people to stay away. So it's finding the right...
Yeah, but there's a
balance.
code of conduct that has been developed by Irish Basking Shark Group, I think, that just says, look, this is how you should behave around them. But something to know too, like, when I go to film a wild animal, if you film a wildlife in Ireland, you must have a permit from the Parks and Wildlife Service. Now, to get that permit, and especially for a drone in the water, I have to justify what my experience is and how I know how these animals behave. And then I have to contact the ranger before I go out, and I have to keep a log of everything. And that's absolutely fine. We should be doing that. So the idea of people just firing a drone up into the air and dropping down on top of these animals, I think it's great that we're promoting these animals and people will see it. But we should be cognizant of the story that we're telling. And ultimately, I do what I do to create awareness. And I donated all of my work to the education system a few years ago. It's now on the junior cycle curriculum. So here's a species that was decimated by more than 90%. Do we really want to disturb them when they're feeding, or worse still, when they're actually in courtship?
Yeah, and that courtship chorus you mentioned earlier on, what is that? Tell us about it. Is that when they're circling? I saw them circling in the video.
Yeah, that's right. So I'd spent 10 years trying to find the fertile areas of the ocean, and ultimately worked with a great friend of mine, Killian Roden, who's a plankton expert, a marine biologist. And, we're trying to say, where are the patterns? We're seeing whales off the Salty Islands and off the Blasket Islands and off Skelligs. And, he kind of thought about it. He said, look, we were looking for an upwelling of cold, nutrient-rich water, which is known as a thermal front, a coastal front. And I'd spent years on the coast at Clare with binoculars looking out to sea and starting to see signs of birds diving down. And I suspected there was activity. And eventually we got out there in 2016, 8 kilometres offshore, and the first thing we found was these basking sharks circling. And two things were fascinating. One was that there was an even mix of males and females, because up to that, almost all the basking sharks I've seen were females in Irish waters. And then the second thing was that it was rich with plankton in the water, but their mouths were closed. So I contacted a guy called David Sims, who was probably the world expert at that time in basking sharks, and he was back within a number of hours. He said, look, this is a bit of a eureka moment, because the hunters had seen it in Cornwall in the 1950s, and it had been seen from an aircraft in Canada. But because I was in the water and I could identify an even mix of males and females, he said this is almost certainly courtship. So I asked a couple of other people I knew to work with us, and we produced a paper 2022. So now we know that these are the areas where they need to be protected. Now, sadly, one of the things that's happened, I've had an awful lot of international film crews contacting me, and people wanting to and lots of people, because we publish where it is, are going, and that's great if you just behave responsibly. But I have to think, Claire, it's down to education and awareness. So I work with lots of divers I know, the Irish Underwater Council, just to kind of say, look at the code of conduct. If the animals approach you, that's absolutely fine. But swimming into the middle of a courtship...
Well, it sounds as though it's hard to police this, because you're relying on people's goodwill, because a lot of people have the technology now and the wherewithal to be amongst these animals, either by using film, cameras, drones, or by diving themselves. So you're asking people really to stay back.
You are, because our parks and wildlife are now getting the funding and the resources they deserve. They didn't for decades. But I mean, the rangers can't go out. There's 2 rangers in most counties. They just can't be out protecting all this stuff. So I think, and I've been saying this to divers and the Irish Underwater Council, we've got to police it ourselves. And, by goodwill, not running out pointing your fingers at people, but just saying, here's a species that's starting to recover as far as we know. Really, we need to behave well around it and not to disturb that.
Well,
So it has
that's
to
the
be
positive to take from this. Aren't we so lucky to have them off our coast? And isn't it wonderful that they've come from 90% depletion to now, we hope, recovering?
Hopefully recovering. And as I said, we're very, very lucky in Ireland that it's one of the best places in the whole world to be able to see the basking sharks. So yeah, it's special. And of course they come here because our waters are really fertile. So.
Now, Ken, I want to ask you what your Instagram handle is, because I know people will want to find that footage, and you said to me you might just put some of it up so people can look
I will,
and
of
see.
course.
So
yeah, just Ken O'Sullivan if you look it up.
Okay.
Ken O'Sullivan, and